This is the new 2022 Lexus IS500, and it's kind of amazing that this even exists. In the world of turbocharging and plug-in hybrids and small engines, Lexus is debuting this, a compact sports sedan with a big, naturally aspirated V8. This is surely the last time something like this will ever happen, and today I'm going to review it. Before I get started, be sure to check out Cars and Bids, which is my enthusiast car auction website for cool cars from the modern era, now with free listings. You can list your cool car from the 1980s and up for free and auction it on Cars and Bids. And we've had some great sales recently, including this AutoZam AZ1, which sold for $34,000. This 2012 Lexus ISF brought over $44,000, and this fantastic E46 BMW M3 brought almost $55,000 with only 2,400 original miles. An amazing car. If you're looking to sell or buy a cool car from the modern era, the 1980s and up, Cars and Bids is the place to do it. You'll find an amazing selection, daily auctions, and a great community at carsandbids.com. So let's talk IS500. That sounds so weird to say. I'm used to IS300, IS350. Well, now there's an IS500, and it uses a 5-liter naturally aspirated V8, the same engine from the Lexus RCF. It makes about 470 horsepower and 400 pound-feet of torque, which are big numbers in a vehicle that's almost exactly the same length as a Honda Civic. This is especially amazing because cars like this just don't exist anymore. There was a time in the mid-2000s where everybody had a V8 in their small sports sedan. You had the BMW M3 with its V8, the Audi RS4, the Mercedes C63 AMG with its 6.2-liter V8, but these days it's all turbocharging and smaller engines, except for this. The IS500 is essentially a new version of the Lexus ISF. They're not calling it that, but that's basically what it is. It does 0 to 60 in the low 4-second range, and it has some other upgrades over the regular IS, which I'll cover. Pricing hasn't yet been announced for the IS500, but I'm expecting it to start in the low $60,000 range when it goes on sale this fall. And today, I'm going to review it. First, I'll take you on a tour of the IS500 and show you all of the quirks and features of maybe the last naturally aspirated V8 small sports sedan to ever exist. Then I'll get it out on the road and drive it, and then I'll give it a DOUGSCORE. Alright, I'm going to start the quirks and features of the IS500 with the most important feature, the engine. This 5-liter naturally aspirated V8, like I said, around 470 horsepower, which is a huge figure for a car this size. It really is an impressive power figure, and impressive that they did a naturally aspirated big V8 in a car like this. Now, you might be wondering, how does Lexus do this? How do they get away with offering a big V8 when all the other automakers have ditched engines like this and cars like this in favor of smaller engines, turbocharging, hybrids, etc. to meet fuel economy standards? I suspect the answer is that Toyota and Lexus sell so many hybrids and electric cars and plug-ins that their corporate fuel economy averages are already excellent, and that allows them the space to make a 5-liter performance car naturally aspirated V8. So while a lot of car enthusiasts are dismissive of the Prius and the RAV4 hybrid and things like that, it helped us get this, which is kind of cool. Now, one interesting thing about this engine, like I mentioned earlier, this is the same engine from the Lexus RCF, the high-performance version of the RC Coupe. But you can see here the engine is branded as F Sport, not F in this car. It's kind of weird that in one car it's an F engine, and in this it's just the F Sport engine, sort of the lower performance line. And I'm not exactly sure why they didn't call this the ISF. It could be because Lexus is planning to drop the F brand altogether. They haven't really done any F cars in a while since the RCF, which came out several years ago, and I'm not sure if they're really going to continue that. It could also be, though, that Lexus didn't really want to commit to all the upgrades to turn this into an ISF. You have the big engine, but there's a lot of other stuff that goes into making a true F car, and maybe they just didn't want to spend the money there for the IS. And indeed, when you really start to look at this car and figure out what it's all about, you start to think maybe that is true. Maybe Lexus really didn't want to put in all the upgrades necessary to create a true F car, because this is mostly just an IS350 F Sport with a larger engine. As an example, the IS350 F Sport offers a dynamic handling package, which includes a limited slip differential, upgraded suspension, and a few other things. That's standard in the IS500. But again, it's optional in the IS350 F Sport, so you can get it in that car too. Now, there are a few other upgrades that are unique to the IS500, but it's nothing huge. For instance, this is only offered with rear-wheel drive, whereas you can get the regular IS with all-wheel drive as well. Rear-wheel drive enhances the performance credentials. This car also has a unique wheel design to the IS500, but again, not anything really huge or exciting or special. This car also has larger brakes than the other IS models, but they're not exactly huge, they're not exactly Brembos, and the brakes are necessary considering it's a faster, more powerful car. It's really no surprise. To me, the biggest upgrades to this car over the IS350 F Sport, aside from the engine, are purely cosmetic. Up front, it's a little bit more aggressive than the regular car, led by a bulging hood. Lexus says this hood rises about 3 inches higher than the regular IS, just like the old ISFs had, and that does look kind of cool. And in back, you have a rear diffuser, which looks more performance-y, and you have these sort of stacked exhausts, just like the ISF did, kind of controversially, when it came out in the late 2000s. And of course, those exhausts sound pretty good. Take a listen. But while that exhaust note sounds fantastic, you can see with that, the larger engine, other stuff just isn't quite enough to make a full ISF model. This isn't an M3 or an RS4 in terms of an overall performance enhancement for the car, and I guess that's why they didn't call it the ISF. Why didn't they want to commit to such a big enhancement? I'm not sure, but they didn't. So that's why this is just the IS500 F Sport. But anyway, next we climb into the IS500, and one of the first things you notice when you get in here and turn on the car is a specific IS500 graphic that comes on the gauge cluster at startup. This is something Lexus is touting in the press materials for this car, and that's when you know you haven't really created a full performance version, when you're touting the graphic that turns on at startup. But it is worth noting that gauge cluster in the IS is one of the coolest in the entire car industry because it moves. Everybody else's gauge clusters are now fully electronic, and they have all these sort of moving displays. They're cool, but this one actually moves a physical gauge. You're looking at the gauge right here, the car is on, driving whatever. You press this little menu button to see more options in the gauge cluster, and it slides to the side to give you a menu with some options. And you can press the button again and slide it back and forth as many times as you wish, and that is just plain cool. I really love that feature. It originated in the Lexus LFA supercar, and they brought it into the IS, and I just think it looks fantastically cool when you do that. But there's a little bit of a drawback to that gauge cluster, and frankly, it speaks to a big drawback throughout this entire interior, which is this car is just starting to show its age. As much of a cool party trick as that moving gauge cluster is, it's an old feature. This car came out back in like 2012, almost a decade ago, and they haven't updated the gauge cluster since. And that means you don't get a full screen gauge cluster, so you can't have a map in the gauge cluster like all of the rivals do, for example, or your media or your phone or whatever. You can't do any of that in there. The gauge cluster has this cool trick, but it's very small and very limited in what it can display, and it's just not really up with the modern times. It's starting to feel old. And again, that oldness, that sort of dated design, is felt in a lot of places throughout the interior of this car. For instance, the shift lever still uses an old school design where you move it between park, reverse, neutral, and drive. Everybody else has gone to an electronic lever, which clears up some space, and it's safer because it can automatically shift into park when you open your door so the car won't roll away. But this still has like the old school shift lever. isn't very modern and it doesn't feel it. This car also still has Lexus's terrible remote touch interface infotainment system where you have to use this little pad down in the center console to move around the screen. This system is an absolute ergonomic disaster, and modern infotainment technology has greatly outpaced and surpassed the usefulness of this system, and it is just difficult to do. Trying to get your finger on exactly what you're gonna tap on the screen, and it always goes too far, not far enough, and it's just truly horrible to use. This car is still using it, and it really does feel like an old system, which frankly is what it is. And speaking of the screen itself, tacked on to the top of the dashboard, which got a lot of negative consumer feedback, and so most automakers are integrating screens a lot better into the center console, but this still has sort of the old school dashboard tacked on screen. And the old feel continues. You look at the center control stack and you can see a CD slot is like front and center as like the biggest focal point of this center control stack. Most cars, I'm not even sure if they offer CD players anymore, and if they do, it's hidden somewhere, not like the main thing you see. But again, this car came out in like 2012, back when people were still using CDs relatively regularly. And another issue with this center console, there's no wireless charging pad. This car doesn't have one. This is the top version. It's gonna be $60,000+. You can't wirelessly charge your phone, which you can do in a RAV4 that costs $25,000. And another way this car is certainly showing its age in this interior is the operation of the turn signal lever, which is very annoying. This is one of those cars where you turn on the turn signal and then the lever returns to center, and then if you want to turn it off, you're left in this sort of endless loop of trying to figure out how to turn it off. You push it up and that doesn't work, you push it down and that doesn't work. You have to give it sort of a half push in the end to turn it off, which is just bad design. BMW pioneered these turn signals in the early 2000s, and Lexus followed suit because back then they were copying everything BMW did in order to try to attract younger buyers. BMW has abandoned this turn signal design, and I think Lexus has too for most of its cars, but the IS is so old that it still has them, and they don't work well. With that said, there are some cool quirks and features of this interior that I like. For instance, I love the climate control temperature sliders. To change the climate control temp, you just slide your finger up or down on this little slider, and that changes the temperature. And frankly, it's very effective, tremendously easy to use, and I think that's better than basically any other climate control temperature changer I've ever seen. Better than tapping a button or turning a dial. You just slide and it seems very futuristic. Another feature I love in this interior, back to the gauge cluster, I love how much it changes when you adjust the drive mode. You have your little drive mode dial here in the center, and you can see there are several different options, including over on the right, Sport, and then you push it to the right again and you go into Sport Plus, and you can see the changes made to the gauge cluster when you do that. From normal to Sport, it's a pretty big change, and then to Sport Plus, an even bigger one, which really does sort of confirm that you're in the sportiest mode, and I love how that looks with that old school gauge cluster. Also, another cool quirk of this car is on the sun visors, you can see there's a little slot. That slot is for like cards. If you have like a parking garage key card, you can stick it in there, and then it's always very easily accessible every time you get in and out of your parking garage, and that's pretty cool. A nice little built-in place for a little card, which a lot of people have in their cars. Next up, another interesting feature in this interior. Amazingly, this car has a rear sunshade. Over to the left of the steering wheel, this little button here, you push that and the rear sunshade pops up. I say amazingly because this is a little sports sedan. The back seats are not really intended for use, and especially not chauffeur driving, but there's a sunshade back there anyway to keep sun out of the rear seats. Kind of an interesting feature. Also in that area by the sunshade control, there's a little button with a camera on it that says View. If you press that, it pulls up a 360-degree camera on the infotainment screen, but the operation of this camera is very strange. It sort of does a whole trip around the car, showing you what's around there, and you can pause it if you want to see something specific, but you cannot adjust the camera positioning yourself. So you can pause the camera in the spot you want to see, but if it goes past where you wanted to look, you're screwed. You have to restart the entire procedure again and let the camera start and go all the way around a second time. You can't just scroll left or right like in everybody else's 360 camera. It makes no sense, but that's one of the drawbacks of not having like a dial to control the infotainment screen. Instead, you have this bizarre camera control situation. And next up, we move on to the back seat of the IS. I gotta tell you, it is pretty tight back here. Frankly, this is another way this car is showing its age, because rivals in this segment, the 3 Series, the A4, the C-Class, they've all grown, and their back seats are a lot more palatable than this one, which really is pretty tight. Not only from a legroom perspective, which is generally not that great in these cars, but even from a headroom perspective. If I sit upright, my head is pushing up against the headliner. There's not a lot of space back here. Like I said, this car only the same length as a Honda Civic. It's really not all that huge. That's just sort of a reality of like a little sports sedan. It's about 10 years old now. One other way this car again is showing its age from the back, there's no charge points back here, none at all. USB-A, USB-C, household, so many cars have that now, not the IS. Instead, you get 2 climate vents. That's it. No climate controls, no charge points, that's all. Probably the most interesting thing back here is the center armrest, which isn't really very interesting at all. It goes down, you can press something, and then cup holders pop out. That's about it. There's really nothing interesting or exciting in the back seat of this car, except for the fact that your head is pushing up against the ceiling. And next up, we move on to the trunk of the IS500. The trunk is kind of interesting in this car. It's pretty deep. It's actually larger than you might think, as you can see, but it has a relatively small opening, and I think that comes from sort of sloping the rear roofline to kind of give it like a fastback shape. That takes up some trunk opening space, so you have a lot of space back here, but bigger items might not fit through the opening, which is relatively small. Now, one interesting thing in the trunk, you lift up the load floor and you can see the spare tire in all its bright yellow glory. I swear they do this in order to shame people into going to the dealership for a tire change the moment they have a flat, so they don't drive around with this ugly yellow spare on the car. But if you need the spare in your IS, that's where it is, in the trunk and yellow. Now, since I'm around back, also worth noting the rear end styling of this car, and specifically the light bar that goes across the back now. The latest update to the IS was not a full redesign, it was like a facelift, but the light bar was one of the things that was added, and it looks good and modern and fresh and cool, except that when you put on the turn signal, it's just a flashing halogen bulb. So you have this combination of the new light bar and then again, this old school halogen bulb showing this car's age, even from the outside. And speaking of lighting, up front, I do like the look of the headlights, this sort of checkmark design. It looks aggressive and bold, and I've always liked how that looked in the IS. Frankly, I also like the grille in the IS. I know Lexus's spindle grille has been very controversial, and I really hate how it looks on most of Lexus's SUVs when the grille is absolutely massive, as you can see here. But in the IS and in the sedans, the grille is sort of pushed down, compacted, and I think it looks pretty good and pretty aggressive in the IS500, which is like a sportier model. I think it's a decent looking design, but only in Lexus's sedans. And frankly, that goes for the whole car itself. I think it's a decent looking design, the IS. I've always felt this generation IS was a pretty good looking car ever since it came out all the way back in 2012. Like I said, they did recently do an update, a facelift to the IS, and it looks better. It's certainly improved, modernized, but at the end of the day, it's hard to disguise the fact that this car is a very familiar shape that we've been seeing now for almost 10 years. But it's been a good looking car the entire time, and it still is, frankly. And so those are the quirks and features of the new Lexus IS500. Now it's time to get it out on the road and see how it drives. All right, driving the IS500. Before I do anything, take a listen. Speed aside. That is an engine note. It sounds fantastic, even inside the car. And I suspect they're not piping in anything. They don't need to do that. This thing is just great sounding. Unfortunately, the rest of the car is not that great, just generally. Now, with that said, there are some flashes of greatness in this car, and the powertrain is certainly one of them. The 5-liter V8 is fantastic in every application they use it in. It sounds good, it's responsive, it's torquey. I presume it's reliable because it's Lexus. There's a lot of great benefits to that powertrain. But unfortunately, there are some drawbacks, and one of them is related to the drivetrain. The transmission hamstrings the car. It shifts smoothly, there's no question about that, but it does not shift all that quickly. And be careful, you're gonna see some reviews that say it does shift pretty well, but actually there's like a shift shock that comes with it that makes it seem quick. But if you really look at the tachometer, it is not shifting incredibly quickly. And when you really think about 470 horsepower in a car the size of a Civic, only doing 0 to 60 in like 4.4 seconds, you know, the culprit there is probably the transmission, and that is indeed the case. It's no modern dual clutch. It's not really that fast. It's nice and comfortable like you might expect from a Lexus, but it's not a performance car transmission. And frankly, I feel like this car kind of lets people down in other areas, specifically the age. The age of this car is just really, really catching up with it. I mentioned a lot of this stuff, like the CD slot being right there front and center, the fact that there's no wireless charger, the gauge cluster doesn't have that much info in it, blah, 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 the old school infotainment. I mean, the car is just not feel all that modern. And that's one of the reasons why I'm kind of surprised Lexus made this at all. The IS line is not getting a lot of buyers these days. I'm surprised they bothered to facelift it a couple years ago, last year, and I'm especially surprised they're not putting a V8 in it. It just doesn't seem like it makes a lot of sense to put much investment into this car, although that's probably why they didn't want to make a full F version, because they knew it didn't make a lot of sense to make a full investment. Not that many people would buy it. I'm going to floor it here on an on-ramp. Love the way an NA V8 builds power. It's quick. See that shift delay a little bit. It's quick, there's no doubt about it, but it's not as quick. Certainly it doesn't feel as quick as an M3. Lexus would probably say that's not quite their target. They're kind of targeting like a lesser M3 segment. If there was a segment just below the M3, that's where this would be. Overall, I actually do kind of like the driving experience more than I expected to. The engine, very responsive and very torquey. The steering and handling is pretty good. That's always been a good benefit of this generation IS. It steers and handles well. It's, again, not on the level of an M3, not even on the level of a C63 or a Model 3 Performance, but it steers well. And especially for the price point, I suspect it's gonna be good. Overall, I think this is a cool car. I don't quite understand why it was made. You know, for years people have been saying, oh, we want a new ISF, we want a new ISF, and Lexus wouldn't do it. And then finally, sedans are dead, the IS is incredibly old, and finally they're like, okay, we're gonna do it now. Except it's not really an F, and the whole thing is a little bit strange. These are not going to be popular cars. They're going to be pricey. It's the end of a model run. The kind of people spending this kind of money for a car are not going to want to put up with some of the old stuff in here, and they're going to want a little bit more performance and power, and they're going to stretch for a C63 or an M3 or whatever. These are not going to be common, but as used cars, I suspect they will be very desirable, just like the ISF is. That car has held its value tremendously well because it's like the only car from that time period that you can trust reliably. And I suspect this car will have a similar future if you can find one. And so that's the Lexus IS500, a compact sports sedan with a monstrously powerful, naturally aspirated V8. I don't really understand why Lexus made this car, but I'm glad they did, and I'm glad that I had the chance to review it. And now it's time to give the IS500 the DOUGSCORE.
Starting with the weekend categories and styling, the IS500 is reasonably attractive, though the look is certainly getting old. Even with the IS's recent refresh last year, it gets a 5 out of 10. Acceleration, Lexus says 0 to 60 in 4.5 seconds, which gives it a 7 out of 10. Handling is fine, not amazing, but good enough, and it gets a 5 out of 10. Fun factor is also fine. It's a fun car in a straight line, but performance is a bit dulled by the transmission, by the steering. It's not an all-out fun performance car effort, and it gets a 5 out of 10. Finally, cool factor, and it's not a striking F model, but it's still relatively cool to have an NA V8 sedan in this day and age. It gets a 5 out of 10 for a total weekend score of 27 out of 50. Next up are the daily categories and features. It's reasonably well equipped, although the design is getting older and it's missing a few things. It gets a 7 out of 10. Comfort is nice and it gets a 7 out of 10. Quality is excellent. The interior is pretty good, but also Lexus reliability is fantastic and it gets an 8 out of 10. Practicality, normal for a car like this, and it gets a 5 out of 10. Finally, value, and these are only okay. It's a good car and a good engine, but big money, and all the rivals are newer and more modern. It gets a 6 out of 10 for a total daily score of 33 out of 50. Added up, and the DOUGSCORE is 60 out of 100, which places it here against relevant cars. I can't see a huge reason to get the IS500 over a BMW M340i, which is more fun, just as fast, and way more modern. I do appreciate the naturally aspirated V8, and this may be the end of the line for that engine, but it's too bad the cool old school engine was paired with an aging car that's only average among rivals.